Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, may I ask unanimous consent that the pending quorum call be terminated?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm here for my 81st Time to Wake Up speech to ask that this body wake up to the effects of climate change and to say this, that acting on this issue will accelerate economic growth, will spur innovation, and will create jobs. We have settled any real argument about the leading cause of climate change. It's carbon pollution. Measurements in the atmosphere and oceans reveal dramatic, even unprecedented changes in the climate. Our scientists know that carbon pollution heats up the climate and acidifies the ocean. That's beyond debate. They know that this is already a problem for Americans and the world. We had wonderful testimony from a NASA scientist today in the Environment Public Works Committee who talked about what they actually see when they look down from the satellites. They take measurements. They're not hypothesizing. They actually measure these things. And the scientists know that continued, unchecked emissions of carbon dioxide will push the climate and the oceans into dangerous, uncharted new territory. So in the face of overwhelming evidence of climate change, some of our Republican colleagues, just a few, are beginning to move beyond denial of basic measurements and basic classroom science and begin talking about the costs of action. The costs of action. Well, that's progress. That's progress. When he was asked recently about climate change, the junior senator from South Dakota acknowledged there are a number of factors that contribute to that, including human activity. The question is, he went on, what are we going to do about it and at what cost? Across the building, over on the House side, Congressman Paul Ryan of Wisconsin has also been talking about costs of action. In his most recent campaign for re-election, he said that when it comes to action to reduce carbon emissions, and I'll quote him, the benefits don't outweigh the costs. Okay, let's talk about that. When we get past the denial, which with a few of our colleagues it seems we have, not all, maybe not even many, but a few, when we get past the denial and we talk about balancing costs and benefits, if you look at the whole ledger, no doubt about it, the balance favors action. Climate change carries enormous costs to our economy and to our way of life. Acting now can accelerate economic growth and create new jobs. The costs of climate change are huge. We even hear this from our own advisors at the Government Accountability Office. In its 2013 high-risk list, our Government Accountability Office said that climate change poses a significant risk to the U.S. government and to our nation's budget. Why? The federal government owns and operates infrastructure and property that is vulnerable to the effects of climate change. The federal government provides aid and disaster response when state agencies are overwhelmed. The federal government is an insurer of property and crops vulnerable to climate disruption. These are major line items in the federal budget. Our Treasury Secretary, Jack Lew, recently explained, if the fiscal burden from climate change continues to rise, it will create budgetary pressures that will force hard trade-offs, larger deficits, or higher taxes. And these trade-offs would make it more challenging to invest in growth. End quote. One example, just one. Last month's GAO report on what climate change means for private and federal insurance for crops and for floods. It warned of increased hurricane-related losses to the federal program They estimated between 14 and 47% increase by 2040, and a 50 to 110% increase over the next century due to climate change. And remember, when you're doubling a number like that, you're starting with a pretty big baseline. Superstorm Sandy wrought $66 billion in damage in 2012. If we are constantly replacing damaged roads and bridges, always adapting farming and fishing practices to suit never-seen-before conditions, and frequently paying out big disaster relief and flood insurance claims, that will hit the federal pocketbook hard. We don't even have to look to the costs of the future to justify reducing carbon pollution today. Increasingly, green energy makes economic sense for utilities, for businesses, and for consumers. Since 2008, prices for solar photovoltaic have dropped 80%. 80%. Austin Energy in Texas recently signed a power purchase agreement for a 150 megawatt solar plant at 5 cents per kilowatt hour, less expensive than comparable offers from natural gas at 7 cents, coal at 10 cents, or nuclear power at 13 cents. The story is similar for wind power. Since 2009, the cost of wind power has decreased by 64%. At the lowest end of the price range nationally, unsubsidized wind power prices are just below 4 cents per kilowatt hour. This compares favorably to new coal generation, priced between 6 and 7 cents per kilowatt hour at the lowest end. The World Resources Institute has just done a brief report headlined, well, it's called Seeing is Believing, the Status of Renewable Energy in the United States, and its headline is Wind and Solar are cheaper than coal and gas in a growing number of markets. And it lists sales in Utah, in Colorado, in Texas, in Georgia, and in Minnesota. Not states that have a lot in common, except that renewables are beginning to outcompete fossil in those states. Similarly, the New York Times just last week in its business section highlighted this shift in an article, Solar and Wind Energy Start to Win on Price versus Conventional Fuels. And if I could ask unanimous consent that the World Resources Institute report and the New York Times story be appended at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
Green energy jobs, they are out there and they are helping communities. Indeed, they're helping communities recover from the Great Recession. Let me use a Rhode Island example, TPI Composites. TPI has a development and manufacturing facility in Warren, Rhode Island, and it's also one of our leading manufacturers of wind turbine blades, and they make them in Iowa. When the Maytag plant closed in Newton, Iowa, leaving as many as 4,000 workers jobless, wind jobs helped the town get back on its feet. In 10 years, TPI has manufactured more than 10,000 wind turbine blades. In Iowa, again, Mid-American Energy pays farmers thousands of dollars each year to site their turbines on their farms. The farmers love it. They can farm right up to about 25 feet around the base of the turbine. There's a little gravel road for the maintenance trucks, but you can farm right up to that, and they get paid for having the turbine on their farm. So it's a win-win that has helped Iowa generate more than a quarter of its electricity from wind. And they're investing more. They have been reducing emissions and moving the state economy forward, step by step, reducing emissions and moving the economy forward. More and more companies in their own planning are seeing the economic benefits from cleaning up their supply chains and reducing carbon pollution from their operations. They see green investments increasing profits. Quote, "Too many people say it's this or that," Apple CEO Tim Cook explained earlier this year. "We've found that if you set the bar high, then it's possible to do both." Outside these walls here in Congress, where the deniers rule and polluter money reigns, state and local political leaders also see that reducing carbon pollution and growing the economy go hand in hand. Almost 10 years ago, in our states and others, bipartisan 9 Northeastern governors came together and formed the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, called RGGI, which caps carbon emissions and sells permits to power plants to emit greenhouse gases. Since the program started, RGGI states that have cut emissions from the power sector have cut them by 40%. Here's the blue line. That's the emissions chart from 2005 through 2012. Well, if cutting emissions was bad for the economy, you would think that the state GDP would have followed downward in that curve. But in fact, you see that the regional economy across these states actually grew by 7%. Grew by 7%. And bear in mind, this is 2008, the Great Recession. And here we are now. So you'd think that during this period, the GDP numbers would have taken a pounding. So the underlying numbers are actually better than this once you adjust for the recession. Early estimates showed that in its first decade, RGGI will have saved New England families and businesses in the participating states nearly $1.3 billion on their electric bills. It will have added $1.6 billion into local economies. Along the way, those RGGI states will have added 16,000 job years. Additional investments are coming online because it's a successful program, so those benefits will grow. Rhode Island has put over 90% of the money generated through the RGGI auctions into energy efficiency improvements, helping residents save money on their utility bills, and making small businesses more competitive. This success led Tom Wolf, the governor-elect of Pennsylvania, a coal, mining, and natural gas state, to campaign for office successfully on joining RGGI. RGGI shows improving the environment boosts the economy. Look north to Canada. British Columbia has a revenue-neutral carbon fee that has reduced the use of polluting fossil fuels by 16%. What has happened to the economy? The BC economy has not missed a step. The carbon fee revenue has been used to lower personal and corporate income taxes. British Columbia now has the lowest personal tax rates in Canada. If our Republican colleagues would like to lower our American corporate and individual taxes, then I have a revenue-neutral carbon fee bill that I'm happy to discuss with them. Evidence from Rhode Island to British Columbia shows that action on carbon pollution spurs innovation, creates jobs, and economically boosts families and businesses. Today, I just got this larger report from again from the World Resources Institute, which is a group that has, for instance, executives from Alcoa and Caterpillar on its board. This is not some fringe group. This is a very responsible organization with significant corporate and international leadership. Here's the lead sentence. A growing body of evidence shows that economic growth is not in conflict with efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. It continues, policies are often necessary to unlock these opportunities, however, because market barriers hamper investment in what are otherwise beneficial activities. That's what we're about here. Unlock those opportunities for our economy. On the downside, here's the first chapter heading. Delaying action will have significant economic impacts. Quote, climate change itself constitutes a significant risk to the nation's economy. The downside is on doing nothing, according to this report. The upside is on changing our policies to seize those opportunities. Why are we here fighting about this? Well, again, to quote the report, the persistence of pollution externalities. Pollution externalities means when the cost of your product you can ship off to somebody else, make them have to take care of it. The persistence of pollution externalities gives an unfair advantage to polluting activities. Externalities occur when a product or activity affects people in ways that are not fully captured in its price, such as the full health effects of air pollution not being factored into the cost of electricity generation. Thus, society, rather than the company, pays the cost. Why are we in this fight? Because there are a lot of companies who folks on the other side are supporting and representing here who've been the winners in that fight. They have had those polluting externalities work in their favor. They have enjoyed that unfair advantage. They don't want to give it up. But, as the report continues, well-designed policies can overcome these market barriers and direct investment into beneficial technologies and practices. New policies can enhance the transition to a low-carbon economy while delivering net economic benefits and, in many cases, direct savings for consumers and businesses. So that's pretty good news. And equally important, taking action helps to reduce the worst effects of climate change, what's coming at us. Don't just take my word for it. Again, many conservative economists, writers, and officials see the benefits of market-based climate action. Quote, a tax on carbon, wrote Hudson Institute economist Erwin Stelzer, need not swell the government's coffers if we pursue a second long-held conservative objective, reducing the tax on work. He continues, it would be a relatively simple matter to arrange a dollar-for-dollar simultaneous reduction in payroll taxes. Anyone interested in jobs, jobs, jobs should find this an attractive proposition, with growth-minded conservatives leading the applause, end quote. That's the economics of it, unless you're shilling for the folks who've had the unfair advantage and want to keep it. But that's not market-based, that's not economics, that's just taking care of special interests. A recent joint report from economists at the Brookings Institute and the conservative American Enterprise Institute described human-induced greenhouse gas emissions as a, quote, textbook example of a market failure, of a negative externality. The report proposed, guess what? A revenue-neutral carbon fee program as the efficient and elegant approach to managing carbon pollution. According to the report's authors, quote, taxing something we do not want, e.g. greenhouse gas emissions, rather than something we want more of, e.g. productive labor and investment, could help lower the economy-wide cost of the program and may even have economic benefits in addition to its environmental benefits. And just today in the Environment and Public Works Committee, I had a conversation with a Heritage Foundation witness in which I read to the witness a very similar quote from the economist Arthur Laffer, Reagan's economist, saying a carbon fee where you tax the product in the ground and relieve taxes on work and effort by people is a net win for the economy. And I asked the witness what he thought about that, and he couldn't dispute it. In fact, he considers himself to be something of an acolyte of Arthur Laffer's. So there's actually a lot of economic support for this. I'll conclude by saying this. If the topic is now not going to be denial, but it's going to be the costs and benefits of climate action, I'm ready to have that conversation all day long. Let's just make sure that it's the whole conversation, not just the half of the conversation that looks at what losing their subsidy means for the big oil companies, the big coal companies, the Koch brothers, and the rest of the polluters. A lot of my colleagues only look at one side of the ledger, how this affects the fossil fuel lobby. If you look at the whole ledger, if you look at both sides, when you look at all the evidence, it tells you one thing, and that is that the costs of climate change are already here. They're showing up in our lives in innumerable ways that carry real economic costs and that carry real costs in terms of quality of life and our identity as a country. And in fact, they may overwhelm us by century's end. Looking at all the evidence shows us that significant reductions in carbon pollution will actually support jobs and increase economic growth. And finally, a revenue-neutral carbon fee would spur innovative business models and technological development here in the United States. If we lose this race to clean up our carbon mess, one of the collateral injuries we'll sustain is that we will not have developed a robust clean energy economy, and we'll find ourselves buying product from the Chinese and the Indians and the Europeans and others. We need to put our industry to the test. They will rise to it. They always have. We can trust them. We can count on them. But giving them a pass does not serve their interests or ours. This will drive market forces to decrease our emissions and grow our economy. We have the tools to do something big. It's been proven in British Columbia. It's been proven with Reggie. All of the economists across the economic spectrum seem to agree the time is right to put a national price on carbon. I yield the floor.